the book of Numbers in chapter 8. Um, Finally, after several months now, I guess we've looked into the book since the Red Sea crossing and the giving of the Ten Commandments. We've gone through the rest of the book of Exodus, and then all the way through the book of Leviticus, and now we're into Numbers, and we've seen little action, and then the great stories of armies and and different miracles and all that has been the mainstay of so much of our teaching. And a lot of the materials that we're looking at, though, are rules and the setup of government, as well as the setup of a whole new way of worshiping God through the tabernacle and so forth. And the Lord goes into intimate detail in these areas. And at first glance, you say, well, those are the easiest things to skip over. And just to be honest with you, I have done it when I've preached through the Bible before. But the more I've gotten into looking at some of these things, the more I realize it forms the basis of so many other things in the Bible. The book of Leviticus is just packed full of things that if you understand just a little bit of Leviticus, it just opens up all kinds of other areas. The message I preached this morning kind of got started from the idea of just looking at what God said as far as the prophets. And you go back and you read what Matthew says, and you will see that many of those prophecies in the book of Matthew, and there's over 50 of them, many of them they're not all the way through. They cut them off in the middle or whatever. And so we see that those prophecies were for the Lord's first coming that were quoted in Matthew. But then you go back and read the rest of those prophecies, or the rest of the sentence or whatever, and you'll see that the Lord, yes, he's talking about the Messiah coming, and the Messiah coming and ruling on earth. And so it's so interesting. The more you know about the Old Testament, the more that you understand some of these things, the more basis that you have for understanding and being enlightened in the New. As we said, in the Old Testament, it's Jesus concealed. In the New Testament, it's Jesus revealed. And so we see not that he's hidden in the Old Testament, it's just that you realize that it's the plan of redemption, and you see how that God is leading up to the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so we now look in chapter 8 of the book of Numbers, and we see now they're getting ready to march. The chapters 8, 9, and 10, we see that God is finally giving the final instructions. And so we begin in chapter 8, and he says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, how many times have we seen that in the book of Leviticus and Numbers, God directly speaking to Moses. And so he spoke to it and said, speak to Aaron and say to him, when you arrange the lamps, the 7 lamps shall give light. And if you go back to the book of Exodus, it tells you how those lamps were made and how intricate they were. And of course, the lampstand with the candle in the middle, and then 3 branches that would branch out. And that's a symbol of Israel, even as we showed a picture of the Roman army and the conquest of Israel. They've got it on the Victory March, or what is the name of that over in Rome, that's still there. And it's an ark that Titus put up, and they were showing a picture of the parade of bringing the children of Israel in captivity to Rome after they had conquered and had destroyed Jerusalem. And the one thing that's on there is a lamp. And so we see that has been a picture, not the Star of David, but a lamp. So we see that is so important. Now this lamp and the lamps that are there, the one thing that we can realize, and we'll just mention one of them, and one of them, they were to have kind of they had something in back of it. I've got something in my house. Somebody gave it to me, but it's a 1776 lamp. And the way they used to do that, they would put the candle in the middle, or in the candle holder, but then they would have kind of like a dish in back of it, so everything, that the whole reflection would go out from that dish or whatever. So it was designed so if you put a candle in it, then you would have that dish in back of it, and it would just reflect outward. Well, whatever here, we see that one of those, and these lamps were used, and they were to be continually lit. And that's one reason Eli got into trouble, because the Bible says the lamps had gone out in Israel at that time. So Eli became very lackadaisical in the way that he took care of the lamps. But here we see that these lamps now were put, and one of the ones that was there, that was one of the main ones, is on the left side of the holy place, not the Holy of Holies, but the tent of meeting. You would, and this was where you would go, and you had the brazen altar, and then you had the showbread, and of course, which represents the bread of life, the bread of God's presence. And then you would have the lamp, the light of the world, on the other side, shining on, guess what? The showbread, the bread of life. So they everything about that tabernacle had a specific purpose of pointing to something that was going to happen in the light of the world, Jesus Christ coming. So these were very important. And so the Lord told him how to do it, and he talked about hammering them out. Now that was already being given, so he just very briefly says it. He says, according to the pattern which the Lord had shown Moses, and that was back in the book of Exodus. Now we see the cleansing of the Levites. So here we have the lamps and the Levites. Now remember, they're ready to march. They have spent now a year, well, actually about 11 months, in Sinai, and they've been setting up their government, their armies. They have taken census of the people. They have organized in different areas. The manna has come, and the water has come. All these different things that had to be set up. Now, instead of being a disorganized group of people marching across the desert, they're ready to go as a huge nation. And don't forget that about 2 million people or more that are marching. And so these are specific things. But now that the Levites have been given their jobs, remember you had the three different branches of the Levites, and one of them took care of the altar or the holy things. Then you had the people that took care of the brazen altar and all the heavy things. Then you had the people that took care of the curtains, and that was a big job. And they specifically had their places. But now we see that, and whenever you have a large group of people, then the bigger it is, the more dramatic you need to make that there's an impact. And so this is the initiation of the Levites. We don't see them having to do this again, but this is where God has said, I have made the Levites, instead of each one of your sons being the firstborn that belongs to me, I have made the Levites that firstborn, so that your sons won't be priests or whatever, no, or they won't be dedicated to the Lord or not required, but the Levites are my firstborn, and they will serve me. And so we see now in chapter 8, verse 5, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the Levites from among the children of Israel and cleanse them ceremonially. Thus you shall do to them and cleanse them, sprinkle water of purification on them, and let them shave their whole body. Now, they never had to do this again, but the one thing that whenever you are going to have an operation today, what is the one thing they tell you to do? I mean, you got to shave your whole body, or whatever they're going to, especially any place that they're operating on. If you're going to have open heart surgery, they want it all gone. If you're going to have an operation on the knee, then they want the whole leg shaved, or what? Because there again, this is a picture of cleanliness. Now, the Egyptians had been doing this for probably centuries before, and that's one reason that the ancient Egyptians, you'll see they were very, very fastidious in cleansing, and that's the reason you see them with the bald heads, and they didn't have a hair on their body. Well, they shaved. Well, that's not what the Lord was wanting them to copy as for the Egyptians, but it was a picture of cleanliness. And so this was their initiation. We don't see the Levites ever having to do this again. But as far as being consecrated to the people, this would be one time whenever you have all these people surrounding the Levites, then you could tell every Levite out there because they had been initiated. And so do you think that'd get into your mind? I mean, these people now have a very special calling that God has called them. And every time you saw a Levite, you would, oh, that's what God did. And so at least until their hair started growing back. But we see that they wash their clothes to make themselves clean, and then you take the young bull, and so he talks about the offerings. In verse 10, he says, "So you shall bring the Levites before the Lord, and the children of Israel. The children of Israel shall lay their hands on the Levites." Now it's interesting. Here we have the go-betweens. So the children of Israel are saying, "We depend on you to represent us to the Lord. And Aaron shall offer the Levites before the Lord like a wave offering." I used to think that were the girl sailors. No, not really. But, they used to call women in the service or women in the Navy waves. But no, that was a special offering where they would wave the offering before the Lord. And so he said, and Aaron shall offer the Levites before the Lord like a wave offering for the children of Israel, and that they may perform the work of the Lord. Verse 12, "Then the Levites shall lay their hands on the heads of the young bulls." So notice the picture here. This was something very dramatic. Okay, we lay our hands on you because you lay your hands on the sacrifices that we bring, because we're depending on you to perform the service of the Lord. That's priesthood, isn't it? As well as the assistants to the priesthood. And so we see this is what God is, what the dramatic picture is, and the Lord was getting it into the minds of the children of Israel. This is the way it's going to be. And so it was something very dramatic, something very picturesque, things that they would never forget, or their kids would never, they would hear of. And so we notice in verse 13, "And they shall stand the Levites before Aaron and his sons." Notice Aaron and the sons, they've already gone through that elaborate thing with the priests, and they've been separated and sanctified for God's service. But now the Levites are these are the assistants to Aaron and the priest. And they, like the wave offering, and so verse 14, "And thus you shall separate the Levites from among the children of Israel, and the Levites shall be mine. And after the Levites shall go in to the service of the tabernacle of meeting." So notice how that he is saying, "and they shall cleanse themselves," and so forth. Notice in verse 17, "For all the firstborn of the children of Israel are mine, both men and beasts." Now, remember the firstborn, the first real significant time when we see that says back at the Passover, first Passover. "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." And so the firstborn were required. And so, but now we see that that God is saying, no, the firstborn is going to be, notice he says in verse 16 or 18, he says that I have taken the Levites instead of the firstborn. No, wait a minute, that's not fair. God changes the rule. No, God can change the rules whenever he wants to. Remember what we said? God is the only God. When he says, "I am the Lord thy God," he is saying, I make the rules. And if I make the rules, I can change them. And that's the reason we have different dispensations, a different way of worship today than they worshiped in the Old Testament, because God made the rules and he could change them. And so here we're saying the children of Israel, and I'm designated the firstborn instead of your sons being the firstborn. The Levites are now my firstborn, and they will have a very special place in the children of Israel. For one thing, they are going to be the assistants to the priests. And so wherever they are, up and down that whole area, the Levites are going to have an influence on the children of Israel. And they're going to remind them of so many things, and they're going to be service of the tabernacle and the teachers, as well as people who will report to the priest. So here you have a whole situation of advocacy to the priest and so forth. So these would be the eyes and ears of the priest as well. So this is all set up. And he says in verse 19, "And I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron and his sons from among the children of Israel to do the work of the children of Israel in the tabernacle of meeting, and to make atonement for the children of Israel, and that there be no plague among the children of Israel when the children of Israel come near the tabernacle or near the sanctuary." So the Levites were in charge. Hey, listen, have Have you done your ceremonial cleansing? Is anybody here unclean? Anybody touched an animal lately? Or whatever. So these are things where they would remind the people. Now they could be lied to or whatever. Human beings are sinners. And so we see that, but these were the filters to the priest. And so we see that in verse 20, then Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel did to the Levites according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses concerning the Levites. And so the children of, they did to them. Notice now how long they served. In verse 23, then the Lord spake to Moses and say, this is what pertains to the Levites. From 25 years old and above, one may perform the service and the work of the tabernacle of meeting. And at the age of 50 years, they shall cease performing their work and shall work no more. Why? Because God didn't want a lot of young brats running around that didn't understand what they were doing, and he didn't want a lot of old men around that couldn't handle the heavy lifting and all that of the tabernacle again. I'm sure they still had jobs that they could do, but as far as the work of the tabernacle, that took a lot of heavy lifting. Folks, whenever you kill 10,000 sheep like they did at Solomon's inauguration, that takes a lot of work, don't you think? It had to be a lot of Levites. We just went out and had roast beef, and that was good. And Jack told us back how many pounds of beef did he had to get. But I mean, they had all kinds of people working back then. They weren't Levites, but whenever you're working with things like that, it takes a lot of organization and a lot of energy as well as strength. And so the Lord said, we don't want the immature, nor do we want people that are too old to do it anymore. And so, yes, they could have lighter things, but as far as the specific work of the tabernacle, no, that's going to be left to that age group right in there, which really is a man's basic, that's the strongest time he's going to be in life. The wisest and the strongest at the same time in life. He might be a little stronger as a teenager, but guys are notoriously stupid when we're teenagers, or whatever. But here God sets it up at 25 to 50 that they can serve in the tabernacle. And so we see that happens. And notice now in chapter 9, the first Passover. Now here's a timestamp. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness at Sinai in the first month of the second year. So here we are in the year number 2. Now, it took them about a month to get from Egypt to Sinai, so they've been there 11 months, and now they're starting a new year. So that's one of those time stamps, I call them in the Bible. And that they should come out of the land of Egypt, saying, let the children of Israel now keep the Passover at its appointed time. So this is the first time you've done it after you came to the this is actually the second time, but this is now very important, and you're doing it right before you take off to Canaan. So let's make sure that we have it all right, and let's make sure that it's all handled right, just like the Levites and the priests, and now everything is it's all settled, that you have Aaron, the priesthood set up, and the Levites set up, and the tabernacle set up, and now this is the first time that it is in this specific order, and God has spent 2 books from the last half of Exodus through the book of Leviticus and now into the book of Numbers, just setting all this up. And he says, okay, now let's practice it. And so they've set it up, and it's at this appointed time, and the 14th day of the month and so forth, according to all its rites and ceremonies you shall keep. So Moses told the children of Israel, so they keep the Passover, and they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at twilight. Remember, the evening and the morning. The Old Testament was always, the day started in the evening, not early in the morning. And so it would be evening to evening. It would be the first day of the week, second day of the week, and so forth. And so we see the tabernacle being set up. So actually that's why, Passover would start, and if it was on the Sabbath, Then it would start on Friday night. And that's one reason some people think that we have Good Friday because that's when the Lord was crucified. I really think that maybe the Lord was crucified on Thursday, but that's a big argument that you could argue about and waste a lot of time. Okay, we won't get into that. Okay, see how easy it is because there's so many different things that you could branch off into so quickly. Verse 6, and there were certain men, what happens about when people fall through the cracks? And you had a funeral or your loved one died, and it was right before the Passover, and now you are unclean. What do you do about that? Now there were certain men who were defiled by human corpse, so they could not keep the Passover on that day. Mother had died. Something had happened. Maybe whatever, you can run the gamut of possibilities of why they came in contact with a corpse, with something that was dead or someone that was dead. And so what do we do? He said, notice as we became defiled by a human corpse, why are we kept from presenting the offering to the Lord at this appointed time among the children of Israel? The negative to that is, why are we being left out? The positive of this is we want to perform, we want to do. So isn't it good? When Bonnie sent me a text this evening, she was telling me how frustrated she was because she couldn't go. Well, I texted her back and said, well, thanks for letting me know. It sure is good to know that somebody was hunting for us even though you couldn't find us. Isn't that good? So there again, it's good to know that people are out there seeking you, even if sometimes you fall through the cracks or something happens. And so in verse 8, and Moses said, and this is one of those humbling things. Notice what Moses says as they go between, stand still, and I will hear what the Lord will command concerning you. And okay, you guys, you go to know, this is something God's got to tell me. So I want God's direction. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel. If any one of you or your posterity is unclean because of a corpse, or is far away on a journey, he may still keep the Passover on the 14th day of the second month at twilight. So notice very specifically, he says, okay, if you miss it on the first month, we will allow these special situations where you can still be cleansed and go through the ceremony, and we will instruct the Levites and others exactly what to do. He says, they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, just like in the first month, and they shall leave none of it until morning, nor break one of its bones. I still love that. I mean, I've underlined that. Why was that so important? And as we said this morning, I think it was in Sunday school or church, that I mentioned, that was something. When you think about that Roman soldier, under specific orders to break those legs so that the shock of it and whatever would cause those people on the cross to die quicker. And yet this man defied orders. And he just stuck a sword in his side. But he fulfilled scripture even there where it said blood and water. That was a prophecy later on. And so not one bone broken. And one of the most horrendous and most painful ways of dying ever invented by man has been the crucifixion. And yet when it is done like the Romans did it, not one bone was broken. And yet just about every ligament in the body was strained or torn. And so it's interesting how that God did that. And why was it, was this 15 to 2 millennia later, when that soldier didn't even know the Lord, yet God changed his mind. Just amazing how that God controls the affairs of men, even down to the detail. He says, according to all the ordinances of the Passover, he shall keep it. But the man who is clean and is not on a journey and ceases to keep the Passover, then that person shall be cut off. In other words, if you abuse the Passover, if you don't partake of it, then you are to really be just considered an outsider. even with your family. Now, of course, we know, well, let's just go on down to verse 18 or verse 14, and I'll explain a little bit more. Now, the stranger, that's the foreigner, not a non-Jew, dwells among you and will keep the Lord's Passover. He must do so according to the rite of the Passover, and according to the ceremony. You shall have one ordinance both for the stranger and for the native of the land, or for the Israelite. So he's saying the stranger, of course, he said that there's one requirement that we have seen, that a stranger, in order to partake of the Passover, was circumcision. And that's the one reason. Of course, circumcision roughly is akin to our baptism as far as identification with God's people. And then, so that's the reason we say that if you're going to partake of the Lord's table, we want you to be baptized first, because, if we're going to, so that's where we get that, is a Gentile could partake of the Passover and all the rites and so forth, but he had to be circumcised. That's the reason we see the good people in the book of Acts, or the righteous man. These people hadn't been circumcised, but they were welcome to come and worship, but they had to be in the back. Now, if they had been circumcised, then they could come on into the... now, again, I don't know all the technicalities there, but in principle, that was the way of doing things. And so we see now that God has set up the Passover. Now we see God's leading. Notice in verse 15 of chapter 9, now on the day that the tabernacle was raised up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of testimony, from evening until morning. It was above the tabernacle like appearance of fire. So it was always the cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. And that's that picture that we need to get it on the Jumbotron or whatever, or some way to get it. We'll have to figure out all the technology, but that's basically the picture. That's one of the best pictures I've ever seen, of that pillar of fire by night. And of course, there you got all we'll put this back down if you want. I've looked at that many a time and just tried to figure out where things were and so forth. But that's the setup. Of course, pillar of fire by night and the cloud by day. And so this was to be the guide of the children of Israel. Now, notice in verse 19, even the cloud continued long, many days above the tabernacle. The children of Israel kept charge of the Lord and did not journey. Now, toward the end of the book of Numbers, you'll see a list of places they moved in the 40 years wandering. There's over 50. And the way I have figured it out, in 40 years, if they stayed equally, and we know they didn't, but an average anyway, of about 9 months per stay. Can you imagine that? Ladies, you get all set up and you got everything fixed up in the tent and everything, and then the Lord says, let's move. How well would you like to move every 9 months? I don't think most of us would, and so men either. And so, especially with my wife, Dan, come and get this, come and get... No, and I'm sure that's the way it is with most guys anyway. the glorified pack mule. But here we see, he says, even when the cloud continues many days above the tabernacle, the children of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not journey. So it was that when the cloud above the tabernacle a few days, according to the command of the Lord, they would remain encamped, and according to the command of the Lord would journey. So it was when the cloud remained only from evening until morning. So that's just one day. When the cloud was taken up in the morning, then they would journey, whether by day or by night. So if that pillar, if they even had to march, can you imagine how that would be? Having to get everything ready to march at night. And so there were times that God moved them on. And we see that whether in verse 22, whether it be 2 days or a month or a year, then the cloud remained above the tabernacle, and the children of Israel would remain encamped and did not journey. But when it was taken up, they would journey. And at the command of the Lord, they remained encamped. And so we see that the way that God charged them now, This is one of those difficulties that especially with businessmen or leaders, that when you talk with them, how do you plan ahead if it's day by day and with each passing moment? How do you project ahead and say, this is what God wants us to do in the long range, and yet I'm supposed to follow him just one day? Well, of course, we know the objective here was to get to the promised land, right? So there was already the goal out there. And yes, so we've got to wait on God how to get us there, but they did have their long-range planning as well as their short-range planning, and that's what we've got to look at. Yes, there's certain things you want to do. I want Anna to sell 50 cars by August, and she's about a fourth of the way there, but I can't tell her what to do day by day. She's got, now of course she's thinking maybe a little bit longer than August, but I'm thinking, I'm pressuring her. I won't, no, but there again, if she can sell 50 cars by August, she'll be very happy. But there again, how do you do it? And it's one thing, getting up in the morning and saying, okay, Lord, this is the day you've made, and this is what we got to do. And so you follow the Lord day by day, even though you got a goal out there. And if it was really rough and said, Lord, if we don't do this and I'm going to starve, then okay, then Lord, you're going to show me exactly. That puts more pressure on me. And so you can see the things that sometimes the decisions you got to make. And you see out there, if you don't make them, then it's going to be pretty rough on you. But at the same time, you got to back up and say, okay, Lord, I know what I got to do in the long run, but the one thing I want to make sure is I'm faithful to you today. It doesn't mean you don't plan. It doesn't mean you don't have your day timer or your planner. It doesn't mean that you don't make your doctor's appointments or your IRA payments or whatever. But it does mean that, like I do every Sunday, not that I do it well, and I'm not making myself a great example because there's other weaknesses I have in that area. But one of the first things I try to do every week before I make any other thing, I just make a little notation that whenever I make my list of things I got to be paid for, guess who goes on top? Is that day by day? Is that week by week? Now, that is just little things that you do. Now, like I said, boy, I wish I could tell you a whole list of things that I do, but my wife knows it, and a lot of people know that, that's one of my big things, the organization. I wish I was like a pastor named Bob Taylor. They said that on his desk, every paperclip was in order. I mean, you open up his drawers and everything was totally in order. No paper was out of place. Anybody like that? I mean, that makes me mad that God would even make people like that, because, my filing system is chronological. Whatever comes in last goes on top. That's what. But you wish you can. And I've worked, I've struggled, and I've done. I've got a lot of my sermon outlines. I got a lot of my filing system worked on, and I got it all in order now. And now, if something happens to me, I don't know who wants it. But it's one of those things that. But it's very important, because the more that we do the things day by day, the more possibilities that God has to use us, because we're prepared for the future. Look how long he took to prepare and to get people trained and organized, like David, who had to lead a nation, 13 years. Joseph, who changed the world, 13 years. So again, how they had to learn that administrative and how to work with people and all that. So we see that God has set this up. And yes, it's day by day, but as we're faithful day by day, then the long range things start coming into focus. Well, little by little, step by step, we sing that song. So very quickly, and then we see that this is the way God is leading. And now in chapter 10, we see that they're getting ready, and now they set up the trumpet system. And very quickly, let's see if we can get through this. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, make 2 silver trumpets. And he says, what is the reason for? He says, in the last part of that verse, you shall use them for the calling of the congregation and the directing of the movements of the camp. So here you have the cavalry charge and the retreat. You have all the trumpet system that is set up with these. And then later on, God would use this whole type of system and expand it to be a relay system through the whole nation of Israel whenever they're in the promised land. Verse 4, But if they blow only one trumpet, then the leaders and the heads of the divisions of Israel shall gather to you. So it's one thing to call the leaders. It's another thing to say, okay, everybody, we're going to move. And so we see, one by day and or one by whatever, land, two by sea, something like that. But then we see in verse 7, and when the assembly is with the gathering together, you shall blow, but not the sound of advance. So notice they have different signals. Isn't it interesting? You didn't know that those cavalry charges that you hear on cowboy and Indian movies actually came from the Bible. you know, in the nick of time, all of a sudden you hear the cavalry coming. Well, that all, it's biblical. And so they had a call for retreat. They had, and it was very important. Those banners and those trumpets were very important, even up and through the Civil War of our country. You had to know where to meet and where to go. And so that's interesting how they use that. In verse 7, and when the assembly is gathered together, you shall blow, but not the sound of advance. The sons of Aaron, the priests, shall blow the trumpets. Notice not only what to blow and how to blow and the signals, but let's make sure that we have one group of people that do it. And so that's whenever I want to get something done around the church, I will ask someone if they would like to lead something, and then if there are questions and I don't know the answer, or if I will try not to go over that person. For instance, if there again, if you're cleaning the church, you've got free reign. You just tell me what you need. And of course, if I see a need, then you'll know it, and so forth. But have I ever gotten into, any of you have cleaned the church, especially, have you find that you do have a problem, and if we start rotating like we've seen before, then I'll tell everybody to go to Anna right now. Why? Because that's, she's the one that's been in charge and done a fabulous job. Well, there's got to be one person. If I tell, and then if we have Sally doing it, and then Jennifer doing it, and all that, and then and Jennifer and Sally don't know what Anna's doing, then you got a problem. And then you got three ladies mad at you, and they're all probably fighting one another. And that's not good. And so here you have the designation, but you keep it within a tight circle. They've got to know how to blow those trumpets. They got to train themselves. They got to be ready in an instant, with instant recall of exactly what to do. And of course we know that the Levites were musicians so many of the Levites were musicians for the nation of Israel even later on. In verse 10, and in the day of your gladness and your appointed feast. So all these were used for this, the beginning of months. So they would even have a trumpet to say, hey, this was April 1st yesterday. And so they had different ways of keeping time and everything else. Those trumpets were very important. Then now we see in the last part, now it came to pass, verse 11, on the 20th day of the second month. Okay, gives you exactly what time the second month of what? From the Passover that happened in Egypt. But of course, the second year. In the second year, the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle of testimony, and the children of Israel set out in the wilderness of Sinai on their journeys. The cloud settled in the wilderness of Paran, and they started out for the first time according to the command of the Lord by the hand of Moses, the standard of the camp, the flags, of the children of Judah. And now notice, Judah on the east side, he led the way. And of course, the two tribes that were with him. You had Issachar and Zebulun in the next few verses. And then after that, Judah leading the way, the head tribe, kingly tribe, we see that then the tabernacle was taken down, and the children of Gershom and Merari, not all three, but just two of them, set out carrying the tabernacle. That's all those furnishings and everything else. And so they came, and it's interesting because if Judah was off to the east, that meant that he would swing around if they were heading north, and they would take the lead. And then the standard in verse 18, the standard of the camp of Reuben. And remember, they were to the north. And so you would kind of go counterclockwise around the camp. And they set up according to their armies. And Simeon and Gad, in verse 18 through 20, tells us that they would be next. Then the Kohathites. So right in the middle of the marching order, you have the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant. Notice how God keeps that right in the center of everything that is done. The tent of meeting, the place where God directs his people. So then the Kohathites set out carrying the holy things. The tabernacle would be prepared for their arrival. And remember, they were the ones without the carts. Why? Because they carried it on their shoulders. And so that would be a very special place. And then the standard of Ephraim, that would be to the south. And Ephraim with his armies, and it goes through that, and armies of the tribe of Manasseh and of Benjamin. The three tribes to the south would be the next. And then in verse 25, the standard of the camp of the children of Dan, the rear guard of the camp. So they would bring up the rear guard. And with that, you had Asher and Naphtali. So they would be the last to go forward. And this was the order of the march of the children of Israel according to their armies when they began their journey. Very organized, isn't it? God was so specific. He helped Moses out quite a bit by telling him what to do. Now Moses, and very quick, let's see if we can get through this. Notice in verse 29, now Moses said to Hobab, the son of Reuel. Now who was Reuel? He was Moses' father-in-law, and he had already gone back to Midian. But now his son had stayed around, so this would be Moses' brother-in-law. And he invites him. Notice he's the Midianite, like his father. And Moses offers him an invitation to go with them. He said, notice, come with us, and we will treat you well, for the Lord has promised good things to Israel. So don't you want to come with us? Don't you want what God has given to the children of Israel? We'll make you one of us. And we see that Reuel, first of all, verse 30 says, I will not go. I want to go back to Midian. But then Moses talks him into it. He says, but please do not leave us. We need somebody to be our eyes. We need to know where the water holes are. This is your area. That's one reason I think it was over to the east of that second finger of the Red Sea that goes up into what would be Saudi Arabia today. But there again, we see that you can be our eyes. You know where these water holes are. And at least to begin with, we're close to the land of Midian, so you've had sheep and everything else out here, so you can help us with this. And so Moses said, please do not leave, in verse 31. And it shall be that if you go with us, indeed it shall be that whatever good the Lord will do to us, the same will he do to you, or do for you. So they departed from the mountain, and the Lord on a journey of 3 days. So their first journey was 3 days. And the Ark of the Covenant went before them. Notice, now where was the cloud? The cloud was over the ark, which meant that it was always in the center of the camp, or the center of the march even. And so the Lord was always the center of everything, even the march. And so they went before them on the 3 days journey to search out a resting place for them. And the cloud of the Lord was above by day when they went out from the camp. I imagine Moses saying, man, I'm glad to get to move. I mean, we're just about a week away from the promised land. And so he said, so it was that whenever the ark set out, Moses said, rise up, O Israel, for the enemies let the enemies be scattered. We're about ready to take it. We're ready to take it to them. And he said, and let those who hate you flee before you. And when it is rested, he said, so when it stopped, he said, return, O Israel, or in other words, return to your tents or return to your camp. for the many thousands of Israel. So here's a little way that Moses would say, let's go forward, or he'd also say, tell them when to stop. But Moses, can you imagine Moses after working with these people for over 14 months, well, actually a lot longer than that, being in Egypt, ready to say, finally, I'm ready to get rid of these people. We're going to the promised land, and that's only about 5 days away. They've already got 3 days, so man, they don't have much farther to go. Don't you think I'd be a little excited if I had to lead those stiff-necked people for that long? And we've already seen the golden calf, and we've seen water from all kinds of grumbling and everything else. And Moses saying, my, I'm over 100, I'm in my 80s now, and I'm ready to give this up. I'm ready to retire. And one of the sad things, I was reading a commentary, and they said, this is one of the saddest things because you know what happens in the chapters to come. And so one thing about Rehoboam, his brother-in-law, he must not have made it. Yes, we know that he made a life-changing decision to stay with Israel, but we don't see him going into the promised land. Why? Because he's over 20 years old. But we do see his children inheriting the land in the book of Joshua. And so it's interesting now that, yes, God, they were engrafted in to the children of, but that's another story, and we better stop now, or there's this trap door might fall through or whatever, so better be very careful. But it's good stuff, just good stuff, isn't it? Oh, a lot of stuff there, but the more we understand it, the more everything else starts falling into line in our lives, or at least in our study of the Bible. Let's pray. Father, help us to know your word, and not just to know it, but to understand it in such a way that it changes our lives. May we understand, Lord, that you are a God of detail. You're a God of systems and timing. You're a God of great love, but also of severe wrath. And so, Lord, may we understand that it's a serious thing to follow you. It's a serious thing to be consecrated to you. And you expect, Lord, certain things, and may we prove what is that good and acceptable. May we not be unacceptable to you, but may we be acceptable, that others will see that we walk with you, that we may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Bless your people, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. 380